I'm building a pair of nightstands for my biggest critic. She's seen every project I've made, and she has a special talent for spotting the one thing that isn't quite right. So these have to be simple, elegant, and good enough to survive both her judgment and my own. They're made from solid walnut, clean mitered joints, and the base that's supposed to make them look more designer than homemade. This is episode 3 of my Projects That Sell series, where I try to find that sweet spot between craftsmanship and profit. And while the goal is to make something that sells, my first test is always at home. So let's see if I can finally build a piece that gets my toughest critics' approval. Everything started with a few rough slabs, and not the nice furniture grade kind you dream about. These looked like leftovers from a deck project, twisted, cupped, and full of knots. But I've learned that good projects often begin with ugly wood. The goal was simple: break them down into smaller pieces that at least pretend to be straight. I start by rough cutting them to length, just short enough to fit through the jointer later. It's the noisy, messy part of the job where every cut feels like progress, even if nothing's square yet. Each board that hits the table saw smells a little better than it looks, and that's enough motivation to keep going. While cutting, I'm already thinking about grain direction and which pieces might become drawer fronts or legs. That's the fun part, guessing which scrap of chaos will end up looking sophisticated. By the time the last board's cut, the pile still looks rough, but it finally feels like the start of something. Plane all of these and join. Well, we need to join and then plane everything. This is gonna be fun. With everything trimmed down, it's time to make these boards behave. Jointing is slow work. One face, one edge. Again and again until the board finally sits flat without rocking. Some of these slabs still had bark on the edge, so the jointer earned its keep today. I take light passes, chasing that satisfying kiss when the knives hit a true surface. Then the planer takes over, louder, faster, and far less forgiving. Every pass reveals a bit more of the walnut's color, and slowly the ugly boards start looking like furniture. I check each one for twist before running it again. A small mistake here turns into a huge one later. This step doesn't look exciting, but it decides how tight the miters will be when the box goes together. Perfect edge now means I can relax later. When the final board slides through smooth, the shop fills with that warm walnut smell, and suddenly the project feels real. And just when things were going smoothly, the planer gave up. No sparks, no smoke. Just an awful grinding sound followed by silence. A plastic gear has lost half its teeth, which meant the entire build came to a screeching halt. I pulled it apart, expecting something simple, but of course it had to be the one part you can't find locally. So the project went on pause for a week while I waited for the replacement. It's frustrating, but these forced breaks usually pay off. During that week, I sketched new leg options, tweaked proportions, and questioned all of my life choices that led me to trust plastic gears in a woodworking machine. When the part finally arrived, I cleaned everything, installed a new gear, and promised to take lighter passes from now on. The first board through after the repair sounded perfect, like the machine was relieved too. Sometimes even tools need a timeout. Because my jointer is only 30 centimeters wide, I couldn't surface the panels in one pass, so I cut everything down to the maximum width it could handle, then edge glued the pieces into full-size panels. It's a bit of extra work, but it guarantees every board is properly flattened before the glue up. Once the clamps were on, I left them overnight and came back to the panels that finally looked civilized. Before touching the saw, I ran each one through the drum sander. Slow, dusty, and absolutely worth it. The sander levels out any tiny mismatch and gives that smooth, ready-to-cut surface you just can't fake with a hand sander. With the panels flat and true, I could finally bring everything to final size. The carcass is fully mitered, so every cut needs to land perfectly square or the corners will never meet cleanly. I take slow, careful passes, double-checking fence angles and labeling each side so the grain wraps continuously around the box. When all four corners line up and the grain flows uninterrupted, it's one of those quiet victories that makes the extra prep completely worth it. These are done. They look awesome. Look at these. Now we can do a dry fit. Well, it's not a dry fit, but we can just put one together and see the backs, how big they are. And only now is the time for us to cut and work the backs for these. So we need two backs. Let's do this. With the panels ready, I needed a groove for the back panel and a few biscuit slots to keep the box aligned. I don't own a dado stack, so I cut the groove the slow way. One thin pass at a time on the table saw until it was 10 millimeters wide. It's a bit tedious, but it gives a cleaner edge. The sound changes slightly each pass, and you can almost hear when the curve starts matching the thickness you need. I checked the width with the calipers after a few passes, sneaking up on that perfect 10mm feet instead of overshooting it. Once the groove matched the back panel exactly, I moved on to the biscuit slots. I marked everything twice, lined up the fence, and ran the jointer slow to avoid drifting across the miter edge. Biscuits aren't glamorous, but they give enough alignment to make the glue up a lot less stressful. The dry fit went together perfectly on the first try, a rare event, so I didn't touch a single setting after that. With the joinery done, the panels were ready to turn into an actual box. Dry fits are my favorite and least favorite part of any build. You get to see the piece come together for the first time, but you also realize how many ways it can go wrong once the glue enters the equation. I check each corner, add light pressure, and take it apart again to brush glue on all the miters. Biscuit joinery buys a few extra seconds of alignment, which feels like a luxury when the clock starts ticking. The trick is equal pressure, not so much that it slides, not so little that it opens back up. I use every clamp I own for the miter boxes. It looks ridiculous, but it works. Once everything's tight, I measure diagonals one last time to make sure it's actually square. Then I step back, let the glue squeeze out stop, and finally breathe. It's the first real milestone, from flat panels to a solid box. With the carcass drying, I moved on to the drawers. Same idea, mitered corners, clean grain, no hardware. I cut the sides, fronts and back, then ran the grooves for the drawer bottom. Everything looked perfect, which in hindsight should have been a warning sign. I like to do one last layout check before glue up, just to make sure the grain flows in the right direction. Somewhere between those checks and the softens, I managed to swap two measurements. The fronts and backs ended up just a little too short. I didn't realize it until after the glue was dry. Classic rookie move. At this point, all you can do is hope there's a creative fix hiding somewhere. Glue ups always start calm and end with a surprise. I brushed glue into the miters, dropped the bottoms in, clamped everything and left them to set overnight. When I came back next morning and slid the first drawer into the carcass, it went in way too easily. Like, suspiciously easily. I stepped back and realized there was enough space on each side to fit a small train between the drawer and the wall. That's not a tolerance issue. That's a math problem. I measured again, hoping the tape was wrong. It wasn't. The fronts and backs were cut short, so the drawers ended up narrower. For a second, I just laughed, because it was such a perfectly stupid mistake. You can fix tight drawers, but when they're this loose, all you can do is find a creative way to pretend it was intentional. How I pulled that off? Well, that's coming next. After a bit of measuring, I think I measured these wrong, but I think I did it in such a way that, well, I know I did it in such a way that we can use them like this. So, even though it's a mistake, at least we can cut the face, because the face should have been like this. I already cut this. We're just gonna cut from it and we're gonna have this stay upwards. In the plan, it's gonna be, well, it is in the plan. This is the orientation. that's supposed to be, but the difference you'll see is only 5 centimeters. So this is 5 centimeters bigger than this, and it's not that big of a deal. At least I don't have to remake the drawers because it's a lot of work for them. So I'm gonna sand them and we're gonna put these up. Once the drawers were sorted, it was time to install the soft close runners. I spent a good while measuring, twice for height, twice for depth, because there's nothing worse than drilling holes that don't line up later. I marked my reference lines inside the carcass, double checked them with a square, then used the runner itself as a template. Installing runners isn't glamorous, but when they're even a millimeter off, you'll feel it every single time the drawer slides. After both sets were in, I slid the drawer on for a test fit. And it glided in smooth with that slow, soft close finish. It's always satisfying. Seeing them line up perfectly was worth all the measuring. I pulled the drawers back out, removed the runners, and sanded away all the pencil marks before moving on. That little cleanup step matters. It keeps the inside of the cabinet looking as clean as the outside. Now it was finally ready for the drawers' bases. The drawer faces are what make or break the whole piece. I wanted the gaps perfectly even, not because anyone else would notice, but because I never unsee them if they weren't. Normally, people use playing cards as spacers, but I couldn't find a single deck in the house, so I borrowed a few cards from my kids. The ones with the doodles and stickers all over them. They worked perfectly. And now every drawer technically has a bit of their art hidden behind it. Once the spacing looked right, I clamped the face from underneath the drawer to hold it in position. Then I actually pulled the drawer out, checked the alignment one more time, and drove 3 screws from the inside to lock it in. It's a simple method, but it keeps everything tight and square without needing tape or fancy jigs. When both drawers were in, the grain followed perfectly across the fronts. Clean, sharp, and exactly how I pictured it. I might just keep those kid cards in the shop. They're lucky. With the carcass finished, it was time to make the base. The design's simple, but every angle matters if you want it to look clean. Each leg gets a 15-degree cut on both the top and bottom. The bottom so it sits flat on the floor. The top so it meets the carcass at the same angle. That small detail gives the legs a little bit of attitude without making them look cartoonish. Once the legs were done, I moved to the front rails and gave their ends the same 15-degree cut so they meet the legs perfectly. Then the side rails. They needed a 15-degree bevel along their entire length to match that leg, angle, and close the gap visually. It's one of those tiny alignment choices that most people never notice, but it would instantly feel wrong if you skipped it. I dry fit everything on the bench, checking that the legs all leaned just the right amount and the end rails flowed into them smoothly. When the geometry finally clicked, the base started to look like it belonged to the piece, not just something holding it up. Clean, simple, and balanced. Exactly what a nightstand like this needs. With all the angles cut, it was time for the glue up, the part where you find out if your measurements were as good as you thought. Each joint uses 2 dowels to keep everything perfectly aligned. Drilling into a 15-degree surface is tricky, so instead of guessing by hand, I made a quick drilling guide from a scrap piece. I set the scrap at the same angle on the drill press. I drilled the holes there and then used it as a template on the real parts. That way, every dowel hole landed in exactly the same spot without the bit wandering off. I made another guide for the side rails, since those had to meet the legs with that same 15-degree bevel along the length. Once everything was marked and drilled, I dry fit the whole base one last time to make sure it sat flat. When the geometry looked right, I brushed glue into the holes, tapped the joints together, and added clamp pressure until everything seated flush. You can't really force angled joinery. It either agrees with you or it doesn't. Thankfully, this time it did. Watching the base stand there on its own felt like the piece had finally found its footing. With the base cured, it was time to attach it to the carcass. I used biscuits for alignment. They make it easy to center everything and keep it from shifting during glue up. I marked the slots, cut them into the top of the base and the underside of the carcass, then dry fit the whole thing to check. When the biscuits slid in perfectly, I added glue to the slots and set the carcass on top. To make sure it stays solid over time, I also drove a few screws from the inside, hidden where no one will ever see them. I know it's not traditional, but I prefer solid over purist when it comes to something that gets moved around. Once it was clamped in place, everything lined up exactly how I wanted, the leg angles flowing right into the miter box. I wiped away the squeeze out, let the glue set, and just stood there for a minute looking at it. That's the moment where it stopped being a collection of parts and turns into real furniture. Sanding is one of those steps that never looks exciting, but decides everything about the final result. I started with 120 grit, working through the sequence until everything felt perfectly smooth. The goal isn't just flat surfaces, but getting rid of every glue line and transition from the mitered corners. I used a sanding block around the edges to keep them crisp and add a random orbit sander for those big surfaces. It's slow work, but every minute here saves hours of frustration later when you're finishing. Walnut is one of those woods that rewards patience. The more time you give it now, the deeper it glows later. I vacuumed off all the dust, ran my hand over the surface, and finally decided it was ready for finish. After weeks of cutting, clamping, and repairs, this was the first time it actually looked complete. For the finish, I used Rubio Monocoat. It's my go-to for walnut. I mixed the oil and accelerator, gave it a good stir, and started spreading it with a rag. The color shift is instant, from pale brown to deep, rich walnut in seconds. It's one of those transformations that never gets old. I worked in sections, letting the oil soak for about 15 minutes before wiping off the excess. Rubio is simple, but it forces you to slow down and enjoy the process. Every pass brings out the grain just a little more, and by the end the whole wood looks alive again. I left it cure overnight, and the next morning the surface had that soft matte sheen that feels natural and clean. No plastic, no shine, just wood being wood. Once everything cured, I assembled both nightstands side by side for the first time. The lines matched perfectly, the drawers slid smooth, and the color was exactly what I'd hoped for. The angled base gives it that modern look without feeling fragile, and the mitered grain wrap ties it all together. Seeing both of them finished after so many small battles, the planer, the drawer, the geometry felt incredibly rewarding. I gave each one a final wipe down and just admired the symmetry. This is the part that always makes the long hours worth it, when the mistakes fade and the result is all that's left. After weeks of milling, fixing mistakes, and waiting for that broken planer gear, both nightstands are finally finished. Clean lines, balanced proportions, and that deep walnut tone that just never gets old. I built this to sell, but more than that, I built them to impress one person whose opinion I actually can't ignore. When my wife walked in, she looked at them for a second and said, "They look expensive." And honestly, that's the best review I could ask for. If you want to build your own, the plans are free and the link is in the description. And maybe they'll even pass your critics test too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next project that sells.